Alara Vance was offered $5,000 for a dead man's junk, and when she said no, they offered her $50,000. She still said no, refusing to sell the last piece of her family she had left. It was a decision that would nearly cost her everything, because hidden inside her uncle's battered tool chest wasn't just his memory, but a fortune worth over $300 million. Before we uncover what was really inside that chest, make sure you subscribe to the channel and drop a comment letting us know where in the world you're watching from. You won't want to miss how this story unfolds. The air in Alara's small apartment was always thick with the scent of yesterday's worries and tomorrow's bills. It was a cramped two-bedroom space on the fourth floor of a building that had long given up on aspiring to be anything more than functional. The paint on the walls was a weary shade of beige, peeling in corners where dampness had crept in like a persistent secret. It was here, in this box of stale air and financial anxiety, that the tool chest arrived. It landed on her worn linoleum floor with a heavy, final thud, a sound that seemed to draw all the light and noise in the room toward it. It was her Uncle Marcus's. The chest was enormous, crafted from a dark, scarred wood that looked like it had absorbed a century of sunlight and hardship. Its corners were bound with hammered iron, dull and pitted with age, and the lid was secured by a heavy brass latch that seemed more like a piece of industrial machinery than a simple lock. It smelled of linseed oil, sawdust, and something else, a faint metallic tang of cold steel and quiet labor. Alara had only vague, sepia-toned memories of her uncle. He was a whisper in family gatherings, a name attached to a life lived on the periphery. Marcus was a carpenter, a handyman, a man who spoke with his hands more than his mouth. He had lived a solitary life in a small house 2 states away, a life of quiet routine that, to the rest of the family, looked like failure. When he passed, there was no grand inheritance, no hidden savings account. There was only this chest, bequeathed to Alara in a will as simple and direct as the man himself. For a week, it sat in the middle of her living room, an immovable island of history. Her 7-year-old son, Leo, orbited it with a kind of reverent curiosity, running his small hands over the rough grain of the wood. For Alara, a nursing assistant working double shifts to keep their heads above water, it was a monument to a life she couldn't afford to contemplate. Took up space she didn't have. It held memories that felt like burdens. And yet, she couldn't bring herself to move it. It was his. It was, in a strange way, him. The first knock on her door came on a Tuesday, a day already soured by a letter from Leo's school about an overdue field trip fee and a flickering light in the bathroom that promised an expensive repair. Through the peephole, she saw a man in a suit that was too sharp, too clean for their building. His smile was a bright, polished thing. He introduced himself as Mr. Sterling, an appraiser of antique furniture and tools. He said he'd heard about Marcus's passing and knew of his reputation as a master craftsman. He offered his condolences, his voice smooth as sanded pine. Then he offered her $5,000 for the chest. The number hung in the air, shimmering and unreal. $5,000 was not a sum of money. It was a solution. It was the overdue rent. It was new shoes for Leo. It was a month of not waking up with a knot of cold dread in her stomach. It was a breath of fresh air in a suffocating room. She could feel the word yes forming on her tongue, a desperate, reflexive thing. But she looked past the man's polished smile, at the chest sitting there, silent and solid. It was the only thing Marcus had thought to give her. A lifetime of quiet work, of calloused hands and solitary focus, was contained in that box. Selling it felt like selling him, like reducing his quiet, dignified life to a price tag. "No," she said, the word feeling foreign and heavy in her mouth. "Thank you, but it's not for sale." Mr. Sterling's smile didn't falter, but a flicker of something, impatience, surprise, crossed his eyes. He talked about the burden of such a large piece, the impracticality of it. He spoke of its market value, implying he was being generous. But his generosity felt predatory. She held firm, a strange, unfamiliar stubbornness taking root in her chest. As he was leaving, he paused at the door. "My client is very motivated," he said, his voice dropping slightly. "Think about it."
$52,000.
Cash. He slid a business card into her hand. The paper was thick and expensive. The number was 10 times the first. It wasn't a solution anymore. It was a fantasy. $50,000 was a new life. It was a down payment on a small house in a neighborhood with better schools. It was a future. The door clicked shut, leaving her alone with the scent of his cologne and an impossible choice. The chest seemed to hum with a new energy, a new weight. It was no longer just a piece of her past. It was a question, a dangerous, life-altering question. That night, she couldn't sleep. The city lights cast long, dancing shadows on her ceiling, and every creak of the old building sounded like a footstep. The number echoed in her mind, 50,000. Why? Why was a dusty old tool chest worth that much to a stranger? It was just wood and iron, filled with saws and hammers. It made no sense. A cold suspicion began to unspool within her. Her uncle had been a simple man, but he had not been a fool. He had been precise, deliberate. There was a reason he had left this specific object to her. The niece he barely knew but perhaps saw something of himself in. A quiet resilience. A stubborn streak. He hadn't left her junk. He had left her a test. The silence that followed Mr. Sterling's departure was heavier than before, filled with the phantom weight of his offer.
$52,000.
The number clung to the air in her apartment, a ghost of a future she couldn't grasp. It was in the leaking faucet's rhythmic drip, each drop a tiny chime counting out the dollars she was turning down. It was in the hum of the refrigerator, a machine struggling to keep the little food she had cold. Elara found herself staring at the chest for long stretches of time, her mind a battlefield of need and suspicion. The wood, which had at first seemed simply old, now looked ancient, imbued with a history that felt both personal and profound. The scars and nicks in its surface were no longer imperfections. They were characters in a language she didn't understand, telling a story of countless hours spent in a dusty workshop, of hands shaping raw material into something of purpose. The pressure didn't remain a quiet, internal struggle for long. It began to seep into her world from the outside, subtly at first, then with an unnerving insistence. A few days after Sterling's visit, a sleek black car, the kind that looked out of place even in the city's nicer neighborhoods, appeared on her street. It was always parked just across the way, its tinted windows revealing nothing, its presence a silent, constant observation. When she left for work in her sputtering, 10-year-old sedan, it was there. When she returned, exhausted with bags of groceries, it was there. She tried to dismiss it as paranoia, a side effect of stress and lack of sleep. But the feeling of being watched was a physical sensation, a prickling on the back of her neck that made the short walk from her car to the building's entrance feel like crossing a hostile border. Then came the letter from her landlord. It was a formal, curt notice slipped under her door. It cited a violation of her lease agreement, a noise complaint from a neighbor she'd never had a problem with before. It mentioned a small crack in the window of Leo's room, a crack that had been there since they moved in. The letter was filled with legal jargon, but its message was brutally clear. Fix these non-issues or face eviction proceedings. The timing was too perfect to be a coincidence. Her landlord, a man who had always been slow to respond to maintenance requests but lenient on rent being a day or two late, had suddenly become a stickler for rules she didn't even know existed. It was a squeeze, a deliberate application of force to a life that was already under immense strain. The world was telling her to take the money. The black car, the eviction notice, the mounting bills. They were all voices in a chorus, urging her to sell the chest and make it all go away. The temptation was immense, a physical ache in her soul. She could end this. She could trade the heavy, silent box for peace, for security. She could give Leo a life free from the constant anxiety that shadowed her own. But with each new pressure, her suspicion hardened into resolve. This wasn't about an antique tool chest anymore. Whatever Mr. Sterling and his anonymous client wanted, they wanted it badly. Their methods, the intimidation, the legal threats, revealed a desperation that belied the chest's simple appearance. They weren't trying to buy a piece of furniture. They were trying to pry something loose from her, and their aggression made her grip it all the tighter. She began her own quiet investigation, not of them, but of the chest itself. She ran her fingers over every inch of its surface, feeling for incongruities. She measured its exterior dimensions and then its interior, a small discrepancy in the numbers nagging at her. The chest was heavier than it should be, even accounting for the dense, old wood. It was a dead, immovable weight that seemed to anchor her apartment to the ground. One evening, while Leo was asleep, she sat on the floor beside it, the only light coming from a small table lamp that cast long, distorted shadows across the room. She thought of her Uncle Marcus. She remembered a single vivid afternoon from her childhood, a rare visit to his home. She had been 5 or 6 years old. He had been in his workshop, the air thick with the smell of cedar. He hadn't said much, but he had taken a small, rough block of wood and, with a few deft movements of a carving knife, had turned it into a smooth, perfect bird that fit in the palm of her hand. She had treasured that bird for years. He was a man of precision, of hidden depths beneath a simple exterior. A man like that wouldn't build something without purpose in every joint, every measurement. His work was his language. The chest wasn't just a container, it was a message. And the pressure she was under wasn't just a threat, it was a confirmation. It confirmed that the message was important, valuable, and meant only for her. The black car outside became a sentinel, not just of her, but of the secret she was now determined to uncover. The eviction notice became a dare. Her fear, a constant, chilling companion, began to mix with a new emotion, a fierce, protective anger. They thought she was weak, a desperate single mother who could be easily bought or bullied. They had misjudged her. They had mistaken her poverty for a lack of strength. They didn't understand that the chest was no longer just her uncle's legacy. It was becoming her own. It was the one thing in her life that wasn't about survival. It was about defiance. The decision was made in the dead of night, in that hollow hour when the city finally holds its breath and the only sounds were the hum of the refrigerator and the soft rhythm of Leo's breathing from the next room. Fear and resolve had crystallized into a single, sharp point of purpose. Elara knew she could not go on living with this question mark squatting in the center of her life. She had to know. She turned off the lamp, plunging the room into near darkness, lit only by the faint, orange glow of a distant streetlight filtering through the blinds. She didn't want to be seen. The feeling of being watched was no longer a suspicion. It was a certainty, a presence that pressed against the thin glass of her windows. She approached the chest not as an heir, but as a detective approaching a silent witness. Her tools were simple: a flashlight held between her teeth, a set of screwdrivers, and a thin metal spatula from her kitchen drawer. She worked slowly, methodically, her senses heightened by the silence and the darkness. The air was cool on her skin. The wood of the chest felt alive beneath her fingertips, its grain a topographic map of her uncle's life. She started with the hinges, great straps of black iron held in place by heavy, dome-headed bolts. They were unyielding. She moved to the lock, a complex brass mechanism that looked like it belonged on a bank vault. There was no key. She had searched every pocket of her uncle's few belongings, every envelope from the lawyer. Nothing. This was not the way in. Her attention shifted to the interior. It was lined with thinner, smoother planks of cedar, their scent still faintly aromatic after all these years. The compartments were perfectly jointed, designed to hold saws, planes, and chisels that were no longer there. The men who had packed the chest had taken the tools, assuming them to be the only things of value. A small, bitter smile touched Elara's lips. Let them have the tools. Her uncle, she was beginning to understand, had worked with more than just wood. She ran her hand along the bottom of the chest, feeling the smooth, even surface of the cedar planks. It was here that the discrepancy in her measurements had been. The floor of the chest seemed too high, the interior shallower than the exterior suggested by almost 2 inches. She pressed down on every inch of the floor, hoping for a spring, a loose board, a hidden catch. Nothing. It was solid, seamless. Frustration began to prick at her. The black car was still out there. The eviction notice was on her kitchen counter. Time was not on her side. She was about to give up, to concede that maybe she was just a desperate woman chasing shadows, when her fingers brushed against something in the corner, almost hidden by the angle of the joint. It wasn't a button or a latch. It was an imperfection. In a chest built with such obsessive precision, where every dovetail was flawless and every seam invisible, there was a single tiny knot in the wood, no bigger than her pinky nail. It was slightly discolored, a shade darker than the surrounding cedar. It looked wrong. Her heart began to beat a heavy, frantic rhythm against her ribs. This was it. This was the language her uncle spoke. Not in words, but in details. In the single, deliberate flaw. She took the thinnest screwdriver she had and gently, carefully, pressed its tip into the center of the knot. It didn't move. She applied more pressure. Her breath held tight in her chest. For a moment, nothing happened, and a wave of disappointment washed over her. Then she felt it. A faint give, a soft, internal click like a bone settling into place. It was a sound so quiet it was more a vibration than a noise. A thin, almost invisible seam appeared along the edge of the floorboards. The false bottom. Her hands trembled as she pried at the edge with the spatula. The panel lifted with a whisper of suction, revealing a dark, shallow cavity beneath. The air that rose from the hidden compartment was dry and ancient, carrying the scent of old paper, leather, and something else, something metallic and cold. It was the smell of secrets. Inside, there was no treasure chest of gold, no stacks of cash. The reality was far more bewildering. The space was tightly packed with a collection of leather-bound ledgers, their covers filled with a neat, cryptic script. Beside them lay a bundle of documents tied with faded red ribbon. Deeds, it looked like, for parcels of land in places she'd never heard of. And on top of it all, nestled in a bed of faded velvet, was a single object, a key. It was unlike any key she had ever seen. It was heavy, made of a dark, non-reflective metal, and its head was an intricate, circular design, a kind of mechanical mandala. The bit was a complex series of interlocking teeth and wards that seemed impossibly intricate. This was not a key for a door. It was a key for a machine, for a vault, for a puzzle. Alara lifted one of the ledgers. Its pages were filled with her uncle's handwriting. The same precise, controlled script she remembered from the one birthday card he'd ever sent her. But it wasn't words. It was columns of numbers, symbols, and strange, hand-drawn diagrams. It was a code, a cipher that guarded a lifetime of hidden work. She sat back on her heels, the flashlight beam dancing over the contents of the hidden world her uncle had built. This was why they wanted the chest. This was worth $50,000. No, this was worth more. This was a legacy of a different kind. The $341 million from the title of the story wasn't a pile of money in a box. It was the start of a journey, a map left behind by a quiet man. The chest wasn't the treasure. It was the first clue. The weight of this discovery settled on her, a pressure far greater than any eviction notice or intimidating glare from a parked car. This was the weight of responsibility. Her uncle hadn't just left her a puzzle. He had left her his life's work, entrusting her with a secret he had clearly guarded at great personal cost. The fear she had felt before was now eclipsed by a profound sense of awe and a new, more terrifying question. What was she supposed to do now? The days that followed the discovery were lived in a strange, dual reality. On the surface, Alara was the same woman. A nursing assistant rushing to her shifts, a mother packing her son's lunch, a tenant dodging her landlord. But beneath that fragile facade, she was the guardian of a profound mystery, the sole keeper of a secret world contained in leather-bound books and a single, inscrutable key. The ledgers became her obsession. Every night, after Leo was asleep and the door was double-bolted, she would spread them out on the living room floor, the heavy tool chest standing guard like a silent sentinel. The pages were a labyrinth of her uncle's mind. There were astronomical symbols, complex geometric patterns, and columns of numbers that seemed to follow no discernible sequence. It was overwhelming, a language from another world. The deeds were just as cryptic. They were for small, oddly shaped parcels of land. A forgotten acre behind a rural church, a narrow strip of property bordering a national park, A single lot in a ghost town. They seemed worthless, forgotten scraps of the earth. But her uncle had acquired them, protected them. They were pieces of the puzzle, and she felt a growing certainty that they were not as worthless as they appeared. The key was the most maddening object of all. It sat on her nightstand, heavy and cold to the touch. She would pick it up, tracing its intricate design with her finger, feeling the impossible complexity of its teeth. It was a key without a lock, a question without a context. She knew, with an instinct she couldn't explain, that finding what it opened was the most important thing she could do. But how? Where could she possibly start? The answer, she realized, was not in the what, but in the who. She couldn't decipher this alone. She needed someone who had known her uncle, not as the family recluse, but as the man he truly was. Someone who might understand the strange dialect of his mind. Her search led her to the local archives, a dusty, quiet place in the basement of the county courthouse. She was looking for records, for anything that might point to her uncle's associates or memberships in local guilds. It was there she found a name, mentioned in the margin of an old property transfer document related to her uncle's house. Arthur Abernathy. Mr. Abernathy was a retired archivist, a man who lived in a small house overflowing with books, maps, and artifacts of a life spent cataloging the past. When Alara knocked on his door, he opened it to reveal a man with kind, tired eyes behind thick spectacles and a cardigan sweater that had seen better decades. He remembered Marcus. A quiet man, Abernathy said, his voice a soft, rustling sound like dry leaves. But his mind was anything but quiet. He saw the world in layers, in patterns the rest of us miss. Alara, hesitant at first, took a chance. She didn't show him the ledgers or the key, not yet. She started with a question. She showed him a photograph of one of the symbols from the ledger, a peculiar drawing of a sextant crossed with a plume pen. Abernathy's eyes lit up with a spark of recognition. "Ah, the navigator's mark," he said, a smile touching his lips. That was Marcus's little signature. He believed that history wasn't just a record of events, but a map. A map you could navigate if you knew how to read the stars of the past. He explained that her uncle had been part of a small, informal group of local historians and preservationists. They called themselves the Custodians. They weren't academics. They were craftsmen, librarians, and enthusiasts who dedicated their lives to uncovering and protecting local history that was in danger of being lost, forgotten, or worse, intentionally erased. Marcus, with his skill in woodworking and mechanics, was their master of concealment. He built the hiding places, the secret compartments, the puzzle boxes that kept their discoveries safe. He didn't just build tool chests, he built vaults of knowledge. With Abernathy's help, the code began to yield its secrets. The numbers weren't random. They were coordinates, but not of latitude and longitude. They were page numbers, line numbers, and word counts in specific, obscure historical texts. The astronomical symbols corresponded to dates. The geometric patterns were maps, overlaid onto city grids and landscapes. The first entry they managed to decipher was a short, cryptic phrase. Beneath the silent gaze of the founder, where his bronze hand casts the longest shadow at noon, the founder could only be the statue of General Thaddeus Klein, the town's founder, which stood in the center of the old town square. Alara felt a surge of adrenaline, a mixture of terror and exhilaration. This was real. The map was leading somewhere. The next day, under the guise of taking Leo to the park, she went to the square. The sun was high and bright. She stood by the massive granite pedestal of the statue, watching as the general's bronze hand, outstretched in a gesture of paternal guidance, cast a long, sharp shadow across the manicured lawn. The shadow's tip touched a small, unassuming memorial plaque dedicated to the town's first schoolteacher. The plaque was set into the grass, flush with the earth. It looked like it hadn't been disturbed in a century. That night, she returned alone. The park was deserted, bathed in the pale, sterile light of the street lamps. With a borrowed trowel from her landlord's neglected garden shed, she knelt by the plaque. Her hands shook, and every rustle of leaves, every distant siren, sent a jolt of fear through her. The plaque was heavy. She had to pry at its edges for what felt like an eternity, the metal scraping against the stone with a sound that seemed deafening in the silence. Finally, it came loose. Beneath it was not dirt, but a hollow space, lined with dark, weathered brick. And set into the brick was a small, metal plate with a keyhole in its center. A keyhole of impossible complexity. Her heart hammering, she took the heavy key from her pocket. It slid into the lock with a smooth, satisfying precision, a perfect fit. She turned it. There was a series of soft, internal clicks like a combination lock finding its sequence. A small, heavy door swung open on silent hinges, revealing a cavity no bigger than a shoebox. The craftsmanship was unmistakable. It was her uncle's work. Inside, resting on a bed of the same faded velvet as in the chest, was not a fortune in gold, but something else entirely. It was a small, leather-bound diary, its pages filled with the elegant script of a woman's hand. And next to it lay another key. This one was smaller, made of silver, and even more intricate than the first. The first key had opened the first vault. It had revealed the first piece of the collection. The diary of the town's first schoolteacher, long thought lost in a fire, a document that would rewrite the accepted history of their community. And it had provided the next step in the journey. The tool chest was a map case. The ledgers were the map. And she, Elara Vance, was the navigator now. The weight of this role was immense, but for the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of purpose that transcended the daily struggle for survival. She was no longer just a victim of circumstance. She was a custodian. The discovery of the diary and the second key changed everything. The abstract puzzle had become terrifyingly real. Elara now held a tangible piece of the collection, a physical object of immense historical value. The secret was no longer just hers and Abernathy's. It was sitting in a shoebox under her bed, a silent testament to the gravity of her inheritance. The schoolteacher's diary, as Abernathy confirmed with trembling hands, was a historical bombshell. It contained first-hand accounts that contradicted the sanitized, heroic narrative of the town's founding, revealing stories of land grabs, broken treaties, and the forgotten contributions of marginalized communities. It was a truth that some would find illuminating and others a threat. This, Elara realized, was the nature of the collection her uncle guarded. It wasn't just treasure. It was truth. And truth, she was beginning to learn, could be the most dangerous treasure of all. She and Abernathy worked in hushed tones in his book-cluttered study, the diary laid out carefully on a velvet cloth. The new silver key, they surmised, was for the next vault, the next piece of the puzzle. Using the same methods, cross-referencing the ledgers with historical texts, they began to decipher the next clue. It was more complex this time, a riddle involving tide charts and the architectural plans of a long-abandoned lighthouse on the coast, an hour's drive away. The land the lighthouse stood on was one of the worthless-seeming parcels her uncle had owned. It all connected. The deeds were not just property. They were access points. As they worked, the feeling of being watched intensified. The black car was no longer a passive observer. One afternoon, Elara returned from work to find her apartment door slightly ajar. Her heart seized in her chest. She pushed it open, calling Leo's name, her voice tight with panic. He was at a friend's house, she remembered, the relief making her weak in the knees. The apartment was a mess, but not the mess of a common burglary. Her television was still there, her laptop untouched on the kitchen table. But drawers were pulled out, their contents spilled onto the floor. Cushions were torn from the sofa. Her mattress was flipped. They hadn't been looking for things to steal. They had been looking for something specific. Her eyes immediately went to the tool chest. It stood in the middle of the living room, its lid thrown open, its cedar compartments empty and exposed. They had searched it, torn it apart, but they hadn't found the false bottom. Her uncle's craftsmanship had held. The true secret was still safe, but the message was clear. They knew she had the chest, and they suspected it held more than just sentimental value. Their search was becoming more aggressive, more direct. The psychological pressure was escalating into a physical violation of her space, of her life. The break-in solidified her resolve but also drenched it in a new, colder fear. This wasn't a game. The people she was up against were not mere antique collectors. They were ruthless and they were closing in. Her home was no longer safe. She was no longer safe. Leo was no longer safe. She carefully packed the diary and the 2 keys into a small bag. That night, she took Leo to her sister's house across town, inventing a story about a plumbing emergency. The lie tasted like ash in her mouth, but his safety was paramount. Returning to her violated apartment was one of the hardest things she had ever done. The place felt tainted, the air thick with the presence of unseen enemies. She couldn't stay there. She packed a single bag, her hands shaking so badly she could barely zip it. Then, she went to Mr. Abernathy's. She found him sitting in his study, a grim expression on his face. A long, thin scratch ran along the wood of his front door, near the lock. They had tried to get to him, too. "They are no longer asking Alara," he said, his voice grave. They sat in his quiet, book-lined fortress, the weight of their situation pressing down on them. The enemy was no longer a shadowy. Abernathy, through his own network of contacts, had a name, the Meridian Group. It sounded like a respectable corporation, but it was a front for one of the world's most ruthless private collectors, a man named Alistair Finch. Finch didn't collect art or artifacts for public good or academic study. He collected power. He acquired objects that could rewrite history, create leverage, or simply be possessed, hidden away from the world in his private vaults. He was a dragon hoarding a treasure of secrets. Her uncle Marcus, Abernathy explained, had once worked for a museum that had been strong-armed by Finch into selling a priceless artifact. Marcus had seen Finch's methods firsthand. It was then that he and the other custodians had dedicated themselves to finding and protecting these vulnerable pieces of history before Finch and his ilk could get to them. Her uncle hadn't been hoarding. He had been rescuing. Now, the dragon knew that the key to the hoard was in Alara's hands. The next move from Meridian was shockingly direct. 2 days later, as she was leaving a meeting with Abernathy, a car pulled up beside her. The window rolled down, and there was Mr. Sterling, his polished smile now looking like a predator's bared teeth. He was no longer offering to buy the chest. He was making a different kind of offer. "Mr. Finch is prepared to be extraordinarily generous, Ms. Vance," Sterling said, his voice smooth and cold. "He understands you've found some of your uncle's curiosities. He is willing to offer you $10 million. A new life, a trust fund for your son, complete security, forever. All you have to do is give us the ledgers, the keys, and walk away $10 million. The number was so vast, so astronomical, it felt like a joke. It was more money than her family had seen in 10 generations. It was the end of every problem she had ever had. It was a life of absolute freedom, of safety for Leo, of never having to worry about a leaking faucet or an overdue bill again. The temptation was a physical force, pulling at her, whispering to her. She could take the money. Who would know? She was just a nursing assistant. What business did she have fighting a powerful, shadowy organization? She could disappear, live a life of quiet luxury, and forget any of this had ever happened. It was the ultimate test. Her uncle had lived a life of quiet poverty to protect this legacy. Could she, faced with the promise of unimaginable wealth, do the same? The choice was hers. Legacy or luxury, responsibility or relief. The entire weight of her uncle's life, of the history he had sworn to protect, rested on her answer. The offer hung in the air, thick and suffocating as exhaust fumes. $10 million. The number was a key of its own, one that promised to unlock every door that had ever been closed to her. She could see it all laid out before her. A safe, beautiful house with a yard for Leo to play in. The best schools, the best doctors. A life where the word overdue simply didn't exist. She could give her son a world of effortless security, a world she had only ever dreamed of. All it would cost was a few old books and some strange keys. All it would cost was her uncle's life's work. Sterling watched her, his eyes cold and assessing, confident in the power of his offer. He saw a tired single mother in a worn coat, a woman who had to choose between paying for groceries and a field trip. To him, this wasn't a choice. It was a foregone conclusion. But as Alara stood there on that city sidewalk, with the traffic rushing past and Sterling's smug face framed in the car window, she wasn't thinking about the money. She was thinking about the calluses on her uncle's hands, the ones she had seen in that one childhood memory. They were the hands of a man who built things, who protected things. He had chosen a life of quiet hardship, of solitude, living in a small, unassuming house, all while he was the guardian of a history worth hundreds of millions. He could have sold these secrets. He could have lived like a king. But he didn't. He chose to be a custodian. He chose responsibility. She thought of her own hands, chapped and sore from constant washing at the hospital. They were tired hands, but they were hands that cared for people, that brought comfort, that did work that mattered, even if it didn't pay well. She looked at Sterling, at his manicured fingers and expensive watch, and she saw the hands of a man who only took. The choice became startlingly, painfully clear. What kind of a lesson would she be teaching Leo if she took the money? That when things get hard, you sell your principles. That legacy has a price tag. That the right thing to do is only right until a better offer comes along. She wanted to build a future for her son, yes, but a future built on a foundation of integrity, not on the sale of a sacred trust. A house bought with that money would never feel like a home. It would be a monument to her own weakness, a gilded cage built from a history she had betrayed. The silence stretched. Sterling's smile began to thin at the edges. He wasn't used to waiting. "No," Alara said. The word was quiet, but it landed in the space between them with the force of a slammed vault door. It was the same word she had said to his first offer, but it was different now. It was heavier, forged in the fire of fear and temptation. It was absolute. Sterling's face, for the first time, lost its composure. A flash of genuine disbelief, quickly followed by anger, crossed his features. "You're making a catastrophic mistake," he hissed, the politeness stripped away to reveal the raw threat beneath. "Mr. Finch is not a man who appreciates being told no. It's not for sale," she repeated, her voice steady. She was terrified, more terrified than she had ever been in her life. Her heart was a frantic bird beating against the cage of her ribs. But for the first time, she felt truly powerful. Her power wasn't in money or influence. It was in her refusal. It was in her choice. The car window slid up, sealing Sterling's furious expression behind the tinted glass. The vehicle pulled away, disappearing into the flow of traffic, leaving Alara alone on the sidewalk, her body trembling with the adrenaline of her decision. She had drawn a line in the sand. She had declared war on a man she had never met, a man with limitless resources and no scruples. The moral dilemma had passed. The practical nightmare was just beginning. She went straight to Abernathy's house. When she told him what had happened, he didn't look surprised. He looked proud. "Marcus chose his heir well," the old man said softly. "Now the real work begins. We can't keep running. We can't hide. We have to get ahead of them." Their strategy shifted from defense to offense. They were no longer just trying to protect the secret. They had to expose it, but in a way that would protect the collection itself. They couldn't go to the police. Finch's influence was too far-reaching. They needed an ally, an organization with the resources and the integrity to handle something of this magnitude, an institution that Finch couldn't bully or buy. Abernathy spent 2 days on the phone, calling in favors from a lifetime of academic and archival work. He was looking for a specific kind of organization, discreet, international, and with a history of repatriating stolen or lost cultural artifacts. He found it in the World Heritage Alliance, a nonprofit based in Geneva known for its quiet, effective work in cultural preservation. Getting their attention was one thing. Proving their extraordinary claim was another. They needed more than just the first diary. They needed to retrieve the next artifact, the one hidden at the lighthouse, to demonstrate the scope and reality of the collection. The journey to the coast was fraught with tension. Alara and Abernathy drove in his old, reliable station wagon, constantly checking the rearview mirror, seeing Finch's phantom black cars in every shadow. The lighthouse stood on a desolate, wind-swept point, a skeletal white tower against a bruised purple sky. It had been decommissioned for 50 years. Using the deed, they had the legal right to be there. The clue from the ledger led them not into the lighthouse itself, but to its base, to a series of massive granite blocks that formed its foundation. The riddle spoke of the stone that weeps salt water. They found it on the seaward side, a block perpetually damp from the spray of the ocean, a patch of dark, wet stone that never seemed to dry. Behind a loose section of mortar, they found the keyhole. It was smaller this time, designed for the silver key. The lock mechanism was even more complex, a testament to her uncle's growing skill. The vault was inside the granite block itself, a perfectly carved compartment. Inside was a ship's logbook from the 18th century, from a vessel involved in the early slave trade, a ship that was officially recorded as lost at sea with all hands. The logbook told a different story, a story of mutiny, of slaves taking control of the ship and sailing it to freedom in the Caribbean. It was another piece of erased history, a story of resistance and survival that had been deliberately buried. And with it, as before, was another key, this one of platinum, shaped like a compass rose. They now had two priceless artifacts. They had proof. That night, from a secure, encrypted line at a university library, Abernathy made the call to Geneva. He spoke for an hour, laying out the situation, the threat from the Meridian Group, and the evidence they held. The response from the World Heritage Alliance was cautious but intrigued. They agreed to send a representative, a specialist in authenticating and securing high-risk cultural assets. A meeting was set for 3 days' time, in a neutral, public location. The race was on. They had to protect themselves and the artifacts for 72 hours, knowing that Finch, having been rejected, would no longer be making offers. His next move would be to take what he wanted, and he would not be gentle. Alara was no longer just a navigator. She was a guardian in a storm, and the waves were getting higher. The 72 hours that followed the call to Geneva were the longest of Alara's life. Every tick of the clock was a countdown, every passing car a potential threat. She and Abernathy had become fugitives in their own city, moving between safe houses Abernathy had arranged through his network of trusted academics and historians. A quiet apartment above a rare bookstore, a dusty room in the back of a university archive. They never stayed in one place for more than a day. The artifacts, the schoolteacher's diary and the ship's log, were their burden and their salvation. They were wrapped in acid-free paper and kept in a climate-controlled briefcase that Abernathy had procured, a starkly modern piece of equipment that looked out of place with its ancient contents. Alara found she couldn't sleep. She would sit by the window in their temporary sanctuaries, peering out at the sleeping city, her mind racing. She was caught in a strange paradox. In choosing to honor her uncle's legacy, she had put her own life and her son's future in more danger than ever before. The $10 million sterling had offered seemed like a distant, foolish dream, but the safety it represented was a sharp, painful ache. She spoke to Leo on the phone each night, her voice cheerful and steady, telling him she missed him, that the plumbing was almost fixed. The lies were a heavy armor, protecting him from a truth he was too young to understand. Each conversation ended with her whispering, "I love you," the words carrying the desperate weight of all her fears. The Meridian Group was not idle. Their methods became more insidious. Abernathy's bank account was frozen due to a sudden, baseless fraud investigation. A vicious, anonymous smear campaign appeared online, accusing the elderly archivist of academic plagiarism and theft, attempting to discredit him before he could speak out. They were trying to isolate them, to cut them off from their resources and their credibility. It was a siege on all fronts. On the second day, Alara received a call from her sister. Her voice was strained with panic. A man from Child Protective Services had visited her home, asking questions about Alara, about her fitness as a mother, citing an anonymous tip about neglect. The threat was no longer just to her or Abernathy. It was aimed at the one thing she could not bear to lose. The message was monstrously clear. "Give us what we want, or we will take your son." The cold, calculated cruelty of it nearly broke her. She sat in the dusty archive room, the phone pressed to her ear, listening to her sister's frightened voice, and for a moment, she was ready to surrender. She would give them the keys, the ledgers, anything just to keep Leo safe. Abernathy found her there, her face pale, tears streaming down her cheeks. He listened without speaking, his expression hardening into one of cold fury. When she was done, he placed a gentle, steadying hand on her shoulder. "This is what they do, Elara," he said, his voice low but firm. "They find what you love and they put a price on it. It is the only language men like Finch understand. But it is a bluff. They are powerful, but they are not omnipotent. An official CPS investigation requires evidence, due process. This is a scare tactic. It is designed to make you panic, to make you surrender just before you cross the finish line." His words, calm and rational in the face of her emotional turmoil, were a lifeline. He was right. This was an act of desperation. Finch was escalating his threats because he was running out of time. They knew the alliance was coming. This was his last, most brutal attempt to stop them. The fear did not vanish, but it was joined by a white-hot rage. The fight was no longer about her uncle's legacy or the preservation of history. It was about her son. It was about her family. Finch had made it personal, and in doing so, he had sealed her resolve in unbreakable steel. The final 24 hours were a blur of anxious movement. They finalized the meeting place with the representative from the World Heritage Alliance, a woman named Dr. Lena Petrova. The location was a crowded public space, the main reading room of the city's central library. It was a place with dozens of exits, security cameras, and a constant flow of people, a place where a blatant abduction or attack would be difficult to execute. They arrived an hour early, separately. Elara entered through a side door, dressed in nondescript clothing, the precious briefcase handcuffed to her wrist. Abernathy came in through the main entrance, acting as a decoy. They sat at separate tables, pretending to be strangers, their eyes constantly scanning the vast, cathedral-like room. The minutes crawled by. Every person who walked past, every cough, every rustle of a newspaper, sent a jolt of anxiety through Elara. She could feel the eyes of Meridian's operatives on her. Even if she couldn't see them, they would be here watching, waiting for an opportunity. At precisely 2 p.m., a woman with short, silver hair and intelligent, discerning eyes sat down at Elara's table. She didn't offer a hand or a greeting. She simply opened her own briefcase and slid a single, authenticated document across the table. It was her credentials. Dr. Lena Petrova. "Mr. Abernathy has briefed me," she said, her voice calm and accented. "You have had a difficult time, Ms. Vance. Let us ensure it was not in vain. May I see the items?" Elara, her hand trembling, unlocked the handcuff and opened the briefcase. She slid the diary and the logbook across the table. Petrova handled them with the reverence of a true expert, examining the paper, the binding, the ink. After a long, silent moment, she looked up, her professional composure breaking for a fraction of a second to reveal a look of pure awe. "They are genuine," she whispered. "And if these are real, then the rest of the collection. It is one of the most significant cultural finds of the century." As she spoke, Elara saw movement near the grand arches at the far end of the room. Two men, both wearing the same kind of sharp, ill-fitting suits as Sterling's men, were starting to move towards their table. They were trying to be casual, but their focus was intense, predatory. "We have to go. Now," Elara said, her voice low and urgent. Petrova didn't hesitate. She had seen this before. "Follow my lead," she commanded, already sliding the artifacts back into Elara's briefcase. Do not run. The game of cat and mouse was over. The confrontation was here. Dr. Petrova's composure was a force of nature. While Elara's heart hammered against her ribs, the woman from Geneva moved with an efficiency that was both calming and terrifying. She stood up, not in a panic, but with a deliberate motion, placing a protective hand on Elara's arm. "Walk with me to the main circulation desk," she said, her voice a low, steady command that cut through the fear. "Keep your head up. Look straight ahead." The two men from Meridian were closing the distance, their casual gaits becoming more purposeful. They were trying to corner them, to cut off their path to the main exit. Abernathy, from his table across the room, saw what was happening. He rose slowly, a frail old man in a cardigan, and began walking on an intercept course, not toward the men, but toward a library security guard standing near the encyclopedias. He was creating a diversion, drawing attention. As Alara and Petrova reached the massive, semicircular circulation desk, Petrova didn't stop. She leaned in toward the librarian, a young woman who looked up in surprise. "Please activate the silent alarm and notify security of a code 7, Petrova said, her voice devoid of panic. "Federal agents are on site," the librarian's eyes widened, but something in Petrova's authoritative tone compelled her to act. She nodded, her hand discreetly moving to a button beneath the counter. The Meridian men saw the exchange. They knew their window of opportunity was closing. Their pace quickened, their pretense of being casual library patrons dissolving completely. One of them reached inside his jacket. "This way," Petrova said, pulling Alara toward a door marked "Staff Only." She produced a small, silver card and swiped it through a security panel Alara hadn't even noticed. The lock clicked open. They slipped through the door just as the men broke into a run, their shouts echoing in the cavernous reading room. They were in a narrow, brightly lit corridor. The muffled sound of a security alarm began to pulse through the building. Petrova led her through a maze of hallways, past bewildered library staff, her movements sure and certain. "They won't risk a firefight in a public building," she explained, her breathing even. "Finch's power relies on anonymity. A public spectacle would expose him. This was a snatch-and-grab attempt. It has failed." She led Alara to a service elevator at the back of the building. As the doors slid open, two more individuals were waiting inside. A man and a woman, both dressed in practical, tactical clothing. They were part of Petrova's security team. They had been in place the entire time. The sense of relief that washed over Alara was so profound it almost buckled her knees. She wasn't alone anymore. She had powerful, capable allies. The elevator descended into a subterranean parking garage. A black armored van was waiting, its engine humming. Within minutes, they were out of the garage and moving swiftly through the city's traffic, leaving the library and Finch's failed operatives behind. They were taken to a secure, undisclosed location, a corporate suite in a downtown skyscraper that was, in reality, a field office for the Alliance. For the first time in weeks, Alara felt safe. Abernathy joined them an hour later, escorted by another member of the security team. He was shaken but unharmed. The next few days were a blur of debriefings and planning sessions. With the resources of the World Heritage Alliance behind them, the tide had turned. Their legal team immediately went on the offensive, filing injunctions against the Meridian Group and presenting evidence of their harassment and intimidation to federal authorities. The false CPS claim against Alara was exposed as malicious and thrown out. The freeze on Abernathy's bank account was lifted. The dragon had been poked, and now the world was beginning to see its shadow. The true work, however, was the collection. Alara and Abernathy, now protected by the Alliance's security, began the systematic process of deciphering the rest of her uncle's ledgers. Each entry was a new puzzle, a new piece of hidden history. The platinum key, shaped like a compass rose, led them to a hidden compartment in the wall of an old observatory, containing the lost star charts of a pioneering female astronomer whose work had been stolen and published by her male supervisor. Another key, found with the charts, led to letters from a Civil War soldier that proved a famous battle had been won not by a heroic charge, but by an act of quiet, unsung sabotage by enslaved people seeking their freedom. The collection was staggering. It was a secret museum of the dispossessed, the forgotten, and the silenced. Her uncle hadn't just been a custodian. He had been a historical equalizer, a quiet warrior fighting to restore the balance of the narrative. As each artifact was recovered, it was authenticated by the Alliance's experts and placed into secure, climate-controlled storage to be prepared for its eventual return to the public domain, to museums, to universities, to the descendants of the people whose stories they told. The Meridian Group did not disappear, but its power began to wane under the light of international scrutiny. Alistair Finch, the man in the shadows, was finally forced to answer questions. His assets were frozen pending investigation. His network of intimidation began to crumble. He was a creature of darkness, and the light was poison to him. Alara's role transformed. She was no longer a pawn or a fugitive. She was the chief consultant on the project, the only one with the intuitive understanding of her uncle's methods. She worked alongside world-renowned historians and cryptographers, her insights proving invaluable. The nursing assistant who worried about overdue bills was now directing a multi-million-dollar historical recovery operation. She wasn't rich, not in the way Sterling had offered. The Alliance provided her with a generous stipend, a secure new home, and covered all of Leo's educational expenses. But her real payment was not monetary. It was the look on Abernathy's face as he held a long-lost manuscript. It was the knowledge that a young girl in a classroom would one day learn the true story of a forgotten hero. It was the quiet satisfaction of finishing the work her uncle had started. The final artifact was recovered a year later. It was hidden in the most ingenious place of all, inside the mechanism of a town clock that her uncle had been hired to repair decades ago. It was his own journal, the final ledger. In it, he explained his philosophy, his reasons, and his hopes for the collection. The last entry was addressed to Alara. "I knew they would come for it someday," he wrote, "and I knew the person who inherited it would need to have a strength not of muscle, but of character. I chose you not because we were close, but because I watched you from afar. I saw how you fought for your son, how you carried your burdens with a quiet dignity that is rarer and more valuable than any artifact. This legacy is not a treasure to be owned. It is a responsibility to be carried. I trust you to carry it well." The words were a final gift, a validation of every difficult choice she had made. They were the answer to the question that had haunted her from the beginning. Why me? The story of the Custodian's collection became a global sensation, but Alara chose to remain anonymous, her identity protected by the Alliance. She had no interest in fame. Her work was the reward. The tool chest, now empty, sat in the corner of her new, comfortable living room. It was no longer a symbol of mystery or danger. It was a monument to a quiet man's courage and a testament to her own. Leo, now older, would sometimes run his hands over the scarred wood, beginning to understand the story it held. He was growing up in a world of security his mother had fought for, but also with the knowledge that the most valuable things in life are the ones you can't put a price on. Alara had been offered a fortune, but she had chosen something far more valuable. She had chosen her uncle's legacy. She had chosen her own. And in doing so, she had given her son not just a future, but a history worth honoring.